Hello, I'm Dr. Tim Jansen. I'm a family practice doctor from Portland, Oregon, who has an intense interest in autosomal DNA and genetic genealogy. Today, I'm going to be building on the last presentation I gave you, in which I introduced the basic concepts of using genetic genealogy to trace ancestral lines in the 1700s. And in this particular presentation, I'm going to introduce you to a new family, the Meeker family, and show you how I was able to use DNA analysis to help confirm an ancestral line. So let's talk a little bit more about this particular ancestral line. My grandmother was Maud Elizabeth McIntyre, whose pedigree chart I am showing here. And if you look down in the right lower corner, you can see that Elizabeth, who married Levi Perry, was an unknown ancestor of mine. I struggled for about 40 years trying to figure out her ancestral line, and I used DNA to help bridge this chasm. Many of us have chasms in our family tree that we can't seemingly bridge with genealogical records, and this is where autosomal DNA in particular can help us bridge these chasms. So let's talk a little bit more about Levi Perry and his wife, Elizabeth. She was from Delaware County, Ohio. She married Mary Perry, presumably there about 1814 or so, and their first child was born in 1816 there. After all of these years of not knowing Elizabeth's ancestry, I finally got a match at Ancestry.com in September of 2018 who told me that Elizabeth's surname was Meeker based on some of the family records that she had in her possession. But the genealogical data was somewhat conflicting as to which of the two brothers, Forrest Meeker and Grove Meeker, was actually her father. Here's the genealogical data that this cousin shared with me. It came to her from her great uncle, Howard Perry, who died in 1964. He had fortunately written up some of his family tree information before he died, and he summarized the situation regarding Levi Perry with this particular paragraph below, which I'll read for you. It says that Levi married Elizabeth Meeker, a French woman, the daughter of Colonel Meeker. She had a brother named Dave, who was the father of Ezra Meeker. And this man, Ezra, he lived quite an interesting life and became well known throughout the West because of his activity in public affairs and went to California, etc. He was very instrumental in helping popularize the Oregon Trail, which is something I know quite a bit about because my wife's ancestors came out on the Oregon Trail. So as I reviewed all of this data, I realized that there didn't seem to be any obvious French ancestry for Elizabeth Meeker after I reviewed the families of Grove Meeker and Forrest Meeker. And also there didn't seem to be any genetic evidence suggesting that Elizabeth Meeker had any French ancestry either. As I reviewed the data, it seemed clear that Colonel Meeker was the Colonel Forrest Meeker, was born in 1769 and died in 1849. It's well known in the genealogical information that we have from Delaware County, Ohio. It also seemed clear that Dave Meeker was a gentleman by the name of David Meeker, was born in 1806, who died in 1879. But he was the son of Grove Meeker, the brother of Colonel Forrest Meeker, and was certainly not a son of Forrest Meeker. So let's explore the genealogical data a little bit further here and see what else we can learn. If we assume that Elizabeth was truly Meeker, then we have to figure out which of the two brothers, Grove and Forrest, was her father. First of all, we note that Grove Meeker left no will, so he didn't provide us any information about who his descendants might have been. Forrest Meeker did leave a will in 1848, but it doesn't mention a daughter named Elizabeth. I've included an abstract of the will for you below. Now let's turn to the census data and see what it reveals for us. First of all, I realized that Grove Meeker had 3 children, 3 daughters under the age of 10 who weren't accounted for. Forrest Meeker had 2 daughters who were under the age of 10. And Grove Meeker in the 1810 census had a daughter who was between ages 10 and 15, and another daughter who was between 16 and 25. Forrest Meeker at that point had a daughter who was also between 10 and 15, and another daughter who was between 16 and 25. Now, Forrest Meeker's 2 daughters who are under the age of 10 have already been identified as being Esther and Mary. So that would seemingly eliminate Forrest Meeker as the father of my ancestor, Elizabeth Meeker. However, none of Grove Meeker's daughters who are under the age of 10 in 1800 have been previously identified. So how are we going to deal with this situation? How are we going to sort out which of the 2 brothers is actually the father of Elizabeth Meeker? Well, fortunately for me, I had done a mitochondrial DNA test for my mom, Betty Jansen, about 8 years or so ago at Family Tree DNA. And she is a direct descendant of Elizabeth Meeker, who was born about 1793 on the maternal line of descent. So my mother's DNA that is mitochondrial in origin, and my mitochondrial DNA as well from my mother, came directly down from Elizabeth Meeker. My mom has relatively few matches on this particular mitochondrial DNA sequence. In fact, there are only 3. And about 4 years or so ago, I had been in correspondence with one of them, a gentleman by the name of GW, and I had traced his ancestral lines, particularly the maternal ancestral line, and it went back to a Dorothy Fox. Well, it turns out that Dorothy Fox is also the maternal grandmother of Grove Meeker's wife, Dorothy Gaines. So this is pretty amazing. And I had realized this shortly after I had gotten the genealogical information and realized that mitochondrial DNA was a major clue for me. And so I had looked up the mitochondrial DNA matches for my mom, and I had realized that there was this connection, at least on the Gaines line. So quite interesting. So let's take a look at GW's maternal ancestral line over at FamilySearch. Here's his tree and the FamilySearch family tree. As you can see in the right lower corner, it goes down to Abraham Fox and Dorothy Hollister, who had a daughter by the name of Dorothy Fox, who married Samuel Gaines, who then also had a daughter by the name of Lucy, who was born in 1754. And Lucy was the sister of Dorothy Gaines. So let's take a look at the other ancestral line for Grove Meeker's wife, Dorothy Dart. She was born in 1771. Her mother was Dorothy Gaines, born in 1745. And then Dorothy Gaines' parents were Samuel Gaines and Dorothy Fox, the same ancestral line as what GW's ancestral line is on the mitochondrial or maternal line of descent. Now let's take a look at Forrest Meeker's wife, Patience Hurlburt. Well, we don't have any information about her ancestral lines at this point. Nobody has been able to trace her family tree. So it's conceivable that she was the mother of Elizabeth Meeker, but we don't have any data on a mitochondrial standpoint anyway to either support that or disprove it. However, the connection to Dorothy Gaines would certainly suggest that Grove Meeker was the father of Elizabeth Meeker under the circumstances. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to doing autosomal DNA analysis, and we're going to go through this point by point, looking at all of the major comparisons that need to be made. And I'm going to start with the most closely related people, which for me include my grandmother, Maud Youngman, whose DNA I fortunately was able to preserve, and another close relative, MC. We're going to compare their data to the descendants of Grove Meeker, who's born in 1794. Now, Grove Meeker is a known son of Grove Meeker Sr. I also have 16 great-great-grandchildren of Elizabeth Meeker who've been tested, my mother and a bunch of other cousins. And then so far, I've been able to identify one great-great-grandchild of Grove Meeker who's been tested, two great-great-great-grandchildren of Grove Meeker, and then also four great-great-great-great-grandchildren. So we're going to go through the analysis in these next several slides, and I'm going to show how I did the analysis using a quantitative approach as I illustrated and discussed in my last presentation. So let's start with the fourth cousin level of relationship here between WW and the two great-great-grandchildren of Elizabeth Meeker, born 1793. So that would be my grandmother and MC. So we were going to run the comparisons, and most all these comparisons were done with GEDmatch, except in certain selected situations where I didn't have access to the matching segment data at GEDmatch. But my grandmother shares 38 centimorgans with WW, and MC shares 28 centimorgans. If we average this at a 5 centimorgan threshold, there's an average of 33 centimorgans that's shared. Now, the expected amount for a fourth cousin is 14 centimorgans. So this is a little bit more than we would expect at a fourth cousin level of relationship. Next, I'm going to run the comparisons at a fourth cousin once removed level of genealogical relationship. In this particular case, we're going to compare WW with the 16 descendants of Elizabeth Meeker who've been tested, who are the great-great-great-grandchildren of Elizabeth Meeker. And we're going to run this comparison at 5 centimorgans as the basic threshold. And you can see the matching segment data there. And we're seeing an average of 16 centimorgans at a 5 centimorgan threshold and 14 centimorgans using a 7 centimorgan threshold. And the expected amount of shared DNA for a fourth cousin once removed relationship is 7 centimorgans. So we're seeing a little bit more than what we would expect to see. If we look at the next comparison, this is also at a fourth cousin once removed level of relationship between two descendants of Grove Meeker, RS and JFR, and two descendants of Elizabeth Meeker, my grandmother and another close relative, MC. We're going to see that they are sharing on average 12.5 centimorgans at a 5 centimorgan threshold and 9.5 centimorgans at a 7 centimorgan threshold. And this is slightly more than the expected amount at a fourth cousin once removed level of relationship, which is 7 centimorgans. Now let's run the comparisons at the fifth cousin level of genealogical relationship. So in this particular case, we're going to compare RS and JFR with 16 descendants of Elizabeth Meeker. Here we see that we're averaging about 6.7 centimorgans of shared DNA at a 5 centimorgan threshold. And if we use a 7 centimorgan threshold, we're sharing about 4.4 centimorgans on average. And the expected amount for a fifth cousin level of relationship is 3.5 centimorgans. Now let's look at the fourth cousin twice removed level of relationship using 4 descendants of Grove Meeker and 2 descendants of Elizabeth Meeker, namely my grandmother and her close relative. In this particular case, we see an average of 9.76 centimorgans shared on average at 5 centimorgan threshold. And if we use a 7 centimorgan threshold, we see that there's an average of 7.7 centimorgans that's shared. And the expected amount, if the relationship is fourth cousin twice removed, is 3.5 centimorgans. So we're seeing a little bit more than we would expect to see at this particular genealogical level of relationship as well. Now let's look at the fifth cousin once removed level of relationship between 4 descendants of Grove Meeker and 16 descendants of Elizabeth Meeker. Here we see that there's a 5.4 centimorgan average amount of shared DNA at 5 centimorgans, using that as a threshold. And if we increase it up to 7 centimorgans, we see that there's 3.5 centimorgans of shared DNA. And the expected amount of DNA at a fifth cousin once removed level relationship is 1.75 centimorgans. So there's additional confirmation that Elizabeth Meeker has ancestry through Grove Meeker and the Dart family, and that comes from a cluster of matches on chromosome 3 for my mother. I'd previously mapped this particular DNA segment back to Maud Elizabeth McIntyre's mother, Harriet Lauren, and one of these matches descends from Daniel Dart, who was born in 1691, who was a brother of Samuel Dart, the grandfather of Dorothy Dart, born in 1771, who was the wife of Grove Meeker. And some of the other matches have Douglas ancestry, and Daniel Dart's mother was an Elizabeth Douglas. So it's quite possible that this DNA segment goes all the way back into the 1600s through Elizabeth Douglas. I also looked at some other matches for some of my mom's second cousins, and Jane Jeans was one of these. She has a match at Ancestry.com and shares 35 centimorgans with her. And this particular match descends from Dorothy Dart's sister, Ruth Dart. And Jane Jean's sister, Myrna Hunt, also shares DNA with this person, as does another second cousin. The average amount of shared DNA is 19.4 centimorgans. And when I looked at GEDmatch, I was pleased to find that this person had uploaded to GEDmatch, and I was able to find their pedigree chart at Ancestry, and I was able to find their data at GEDmatch as well and run all the comparisons I needed to. Here you can see the ancestry going back to Ruth Dart, born 1769. Here's the comparison data showing the start and stop positions for all the matching segment data at a 5 centimorgan threshold. There is another match who also has Dart ancestry and also descends from Ruth Dart. This is RA. Here's his pedigree chart. And here's the matching segment data for him laid out in a table. In this particular case, he shares 13 centimorgans on average. Note, though, that there are a fair number of smaller segments or half identical regions. Some of these may not be true matches, and they may be false matches, particularly the matches under 300 to 400 SNPs may well be false matches, and I'm going to discount them as being true matches. But the longer segments, the 20 to 30 centimorgan matches, are almost certainly true. So here's the comparison of GEDmatch for these fifth cousins once removed and the descendants of Dorothy Dart, born 1771. So using a 5 centimorgan threshold, there's an average of 12 centimorgans that's shared. And if we raise that threshold to 7 centimorgans, we see that there's about 10.75 centimorgans that is shared. This is more than we would expect for a fifth cousin once removed relationship, because some of these larger segments got passed down through the family. So in summary, what I've done is I've done a series of quantitative and autosomal DNA analyses, as well as looked at a full mitochondrial DNA sequence to help me confirm that Elizabeth Meeker, born 1793, was indeed a Meeker, and that her parents were Grove Meeker and Dorothy Dart. And I've also done some triangulation and helped confirm that Dorothy Dart's parents were Nathan Dart and Dorothy Gaines. The mitochondrial DNA sequence also helped me confirm this. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And I also would like to acknowledge professional genealogist Danny Hall, who helped me research some of these Meeker lines and did some extensive research with me on the Dart and Meeker ancestral lines. Thank you very much.